One of my first podcasts was about finding and tracking animals. Now, you may have listened to it. I put it out 2 or 3 years ago now, so it's quite an old one. And I just wanted to share some of the understanding or some of the information, I suppose, that I'd learnt both tracking land animals and finding animals at sea. So, both of those can be quite challenging because in the ocean, it might appear to be fairly easy because you've got the ocean, you've got what's below the surface, what's above the surface, and obviously it's the stuff above the surface that you want to take photographs of. But finding animals, even something as big as a humpback whale, can be a bit tricky if you've got a lot of sea to cover, to look at. You can't be looking everywhere at the same time. And if you get certain weather conditions, that can definitely make it very difficult. And by the same token, when you're looking for animals on land, you might be in an area where it's quite deserty, where again, there's not very much about, or you could be in thick forest. And how you find animals in those different situations can be very tricky as well. So I thought it was worth sharing this. And the other reason for revisiting this idea, I suppose, is to also allow you to apply it to your own home. If you're in an area where you have a bit of countryside or you have wildlife come into your garden or in the land near where you live, what are the things to look for so that you can identify what kind of animals are visiting you, are living with you in your neighborhood? And what does that tell you? What do you need to think about if you want to take photographs of those animals? So I'm actually going to start with land animals, and basically any evidence left by an animal that it's in the area is referred to as spoor. And spoor can be footprints, it can be dung, it can be broken vegetation or broken anything else really, depending on what the animal is. And the thing about spoor, the thing about understanding what you're seeing when you look at spoor is that basically it's almost another language. It's the language of what's been happening in that area over the last few hours, most likely, because on land we've got wind, we've got rain, snow, whatever it is, that covers up old tracks, might cover up dung, it will cover up perhaps damaged areas as well. So spoor typically is telling you what has happened in the last few hours. But having said that, it will tell you the sequence that things have happened in, where the animal was, where it's going, all these kind of things. So by having an understanding of spoor, and if you are interested in this, I definitely recommend you just do a bit of research on the web. I don't have any books actually to point you to, but there are various books around that are designed for people who want to get into primarily tourism, but tracking animals so you can become a guide. And those books or those articles, whatever it is you're looking at, will refer to a particular environment, particular group of animals. So it does depend on what you're interested in. And that group might be just what's in an urban environment where you live. So by no means is this restricted just to wild animals. So what does spoor tell you? Now, there is one other thing in addition to spoor, so I'll come on to that. And that's a very dynamic, very live kind of information about what's happening on with animals. But with spoor, I've been involved when I was certainly in Zimbabwe. I took every opportunity I could to track animals. Now, I've also been helping out tracking elephants in Namibia was another one. And it doesn't really matter where I am. I like to look around and see if I can work out what's going on. And I remember, years ago, back in 1997, would you believe, a long time ago, I rode a motorcycle around Australia on my own. And again, there's some podcasts relating to that particular story as well. But I remember I stopped somewhere. I'd gone on a little trip somewhere, and we were in the desert, and well, it was kind of very sandy. There were trees and things around as well, but it was essentially an environment where when there was a lot of water, there would be a river there. Most of the time, there wasn't enough water for a river, and it was very, very dry, very sandy. And I remember walking through this place. It was kind of like a clearing, if you can imagine a sort of sandy, the ground was very sandy. There's a clear stretch where the river, when it was full of water, would run. And then either side you had trees. In fact, there was a little dip where the river would have been as well when there was water. So it was like walking down a dry riverbank across the riverbed and then up the other side. And there was also a ford there as well, which obviously would be a proper ford when there was water around, or it was just part of the roadway. Again, trackway that you would use to get from one place to another. So walking along this place, I'd kind of separated from the little group I was with, and it struck me just how quiet it was there. You could hear insects and the occasional bird, but it was very, very quiet, actually very serene, and it looked like absolutely nothing was around. There's other than these noises of insects that I could hear. I couldn't see any movement. I couldn't see any evidence of animals being around until I started to look more closely at what was at my feet. And then I could see lines in the sand that were formed. One looked like it was formed by a snake moving through the sand there. And then over the top of that snake track, there was something that I was guessing a little bit, but it looked like it had been made by a millipede, because there are lots and lots of very small footprints, very close together in terms of the width of the animal, but sort of going from one place to another. And so looking around, if you are in places like this, particularly where there's a ground surface that is quite soft and where it's easy to leave tracks, the sand is ideal. Always have a look around and start looking at the evidence for animals. Now, what I've just described, one of the things straight away that I know is that the snake went through before the millipede did, because the millipede's tracks went over the top of the snake track. So that was one thing. Now, if you're looking at sand, you get another clue. And this was pointed out to me when I was in Namibia and we were tracking elephants. Now, if you think of an elephant's foot, if you look at the bottom of an elephant's foot, you'll actually see it's a bit like our feet. There's a lot of thick skin there, but it forms ridges or little lines in the foot. And you can imagine with an elephant, what would be a little line in our foot is actually quite a big line, and it will leave a very distinct track. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, next time you get a chance to look at the photograph of an elephant, the underside of an elephant's foot, which shouldn't be too hard to find, you'll see that there are lots of lines there. They're a little bit like our hands and feet, obviously. So one of the things about that, one of the things that gave me an idea, or the tracker an idea of how recent the footprints were, was that when the print is first made, obviously you've got, in this case, dry sand and a firm impression as the elephant's foot goes over. Obviously an elephant is quite a heavy animal, so it will leave quite a distinct footprint in that kind of loose surface. And all of the lines left from the ridges and the little lines in the foot are very distinct. And then as the wind comes through, it gradually blows the sand off the top of the little ridges that are made by the footprint, and that footprint becomes less distinct as time goes on. So that's another thing to look at if you're in an environment where it's quite sandy. Now, the really obvious thing to do if you are looking at what's around is to get an idea of what different animals' footprints look like. Now, I'm not really going to go into that because it's easy enough to find things on the web, and I don't know where you're looking, so I don't know what kind of animals are relevant. I guess another story, when I was in Uganda and we stayed at one of these little, it wasn't quite glamping. It was sort of like that. We had tents, but they were on wooden platforms, and it was a hotel type of place. And you basically would walk from where you were going out to your tent. There was also another, a separate block which had plumbing in it. So that had sinks, toilets, showers. So that wasn't in the tent, which is why I'm saying it wasn't glamping. And basically at that place, and this is slightly unusual for those kind of places that I've been in, if you were going anywhere, if you needed to use the bathroom at night, for example, what you would do is just get out onto the veranda in front of your tent on the wooden platform, show a light, so whether it was from your smartphone or head torch, whatever, and one of the hotel staff would come along and just escort you to where you needed to go and then escort you back again. And the reason for that was that animals would walk through that area where the tents were. And on the last day I was there, we had a bull elephant come through. In fact, I think earlier that morning, somebody else had seen a hippo. So we get, these animals go through. So it depends on where you are. And when I've been at places where you camp, so in this case, I'm thinking about camping near the rim of the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. There's a bunch of tents, and then a little distance away there was again one of these blocks with plumbing in it. So it had the toilets and the shower. And at night, as occasionally I have to, I sort of had a walk with my torch to use the facilities, and then walk back to my tent again. Found my tent among the others. And then the following morning, when I went out to just go clean my teeth, I noticed there was a lot of tracks around. There was a lot of animal dung around, and obviously this had all happened. Let's say obviously, but take my word for it, this had all happened during the night. So you do need to be aware, and if you stay anywhere like that, the people who run things or the people who are escorting you will give you a briefing on what the procedure is if you just stop you having a bit of a shock and a kind of wildlife encounter that is a bit more intimate than you'd like. So going back to Uganda, we had very heavy rain one night. And the thing about the rain, and we had sandy tracks, so there were pathways, but they were basically sandy. And we had quite heavy rain on the night we arrived. And couple of days later, we happened to be walking, myself and somebody else walking down the path. We found a track, an animal track on the path in the sand. And it was definitely a paw print. And there was a bit of speculation about what it was. Some people thought it was a lion. Now, I happen to know that an adult lion footprint is about the size of my hand or a little bit bigger. And this footprint was smaller. And also, I remembered that night I'd heard some sounds that sounded like, to me, hyenas. So that was kind of my conclusion. And in fact, that proved to be the case, that it was a hyena wandering through between the tents, hence the reason why the staff were there to make sure that we could get safely where we needed to be. So having some knowledge of tracks and what to look for is very helpful. If you are tracking an animal and trying to get close to it, and I did this, I've done this a couple of times, particularly with rhino and elephants. And so we're obviously looking at footprints where we can. You might find with a big animal like that, they've broken tree branches, or there's vegetation scattered, particularly in the case of elephants, because they can be a little bit messy as they go through. So there will be that evidence as well. And then if you've got animal dung, something that tells you how recently the animal went through is basically how warm it is and how wet it is. So as you can imagine, when it first comes out, it's quite warm and quite wet usually. And then as time goes on, it will cool down and dry out. So now some people like to stick their finger in it. Some people don't. It's whatever works for you if you're in that situation. Another thing I noticed, though, was the dung beetles. And following this track that an elephant had left, there was quite a lot of dung, and it was gradually getting warmer and wetter as we followed the tracks and everything. But the dung beetles were changing in species. So again, this is another clue if you have the time and the motivation to study it. Even the species of dung beetle that is in the dung could tell you something about what's going on, perhaps how recently, whether it's a few hours or even a few minutes since the animal went through. So there are these indicators just from what's lying on the ground. And then where I live, I'm living in France at the moment, and where I live, I have a kind of gravelly drive, and quite often I will find marks in the drive. So I know we have deer in the area because they sometimes come into the top of the garden. But obviously at night, from looking at the tracks that are left in the gravel, I can see that they come all the way down and around the house. So I know I get that company going on while I'm asleep. So that's what's on the ground. Now, the other thing I mentioned was what you can hear. So I've already mentioned that in the case of this hyena in Uganda, I'd heard what sounded like a hyena call that night. So that was kind of a clue. And then just the size of the footprint was the other clue. So once again, if you are going somewhere, if you get the chance, it's worth just familiarizing yourself with some of the noises that different animals make at night so that you've got a chance of identifying them without even moving, just by listening. So that's one clue to what's around. Now, the other thing about sound, if you're tracking an animal, particularly if you're tracking a predator, so this was definitely the case when I was in India when we were looking for tigers. That whole area was quite forested. It was like, it was basically a forest is where we were, with roads going through it that we would use, sort of dusty tracks that we would use to get to different parts of the reserve. This is the Karna Reserve in Madhya Pradesh. And of course, what the tracker is doing in the car, he's looking for the kind of things I've already spoken about. So what the trackers would do first thing in the morning is get together before they took the guests off with them, and then just exchange information about what they'd seen, where they'd seen tigers, which areas of the park, and that might be the previous day, or if it's an afternoon trip, it might have been that morning. So they'll have some knowledge of where animals were last seen, and this was also happened in the case of tracking gorillas, that the trackers there would track the gorillas all day. They'd have one group per day to go and see them, and then they would leave them at night, and then the following morning they would come back and then try and find them again from starting at the previous place they were the day before. And then it was a case of talking by radio, the trackers and then the guide who had the group of people, and getting everyone together. So that's kind of standard where you have trackers. So going back to India, we're looking at footprints, and we definitely saw tiger footprints in, again, this sort of sandy track that we were using to get around the park. But the other thing to listen for is not so much the sound of the tiger itself. I mentioned hyenas, and I could hear hyenas calling. But be aware that most animals, when there's a predator about, will sound some sort of alarm call to protect the other people in their group. Or you might have a symbiotic relationship, which happens with chital, which are a small deer in India, and grey langurs, which are monkeys. The chitals are on the ground, the monkeys are in the trees, and they tend to graze together. I guess graze and browse if you're in a tree. And they do that because combined, they have a better early warning system if there's a tiger about. So the thing we would listen for as well is just an alarm call by one of these animals, and there are other animals around as well, bigger deer, that would also make an alarm call. So one of them that we would listen for was a kind of barking noise, and that was the sound that one of these larger deer would make when a tiger was in the area. So of course, when you're tracking and you hear that sound, you then try and work out exactly where it's coming from, because that tells you where that tiger is likely to be. So these are just some things that go on when you're looking for animals. And just staying with land animals for a little bit longer, of course, the other thing, if you're somewhere where it's not always very wet, particularly in a dry season, what animals will do is congregate around water holes, because obviously they need to be drinking every day, and that's where they'll go. So obviously where the prey animals are, that's where you're going to find the predators. So if in doubt, work out where the prey animals tend to hang out and then just sit and wait there. And it could take a while. It depends on their hunting patterns, but that's the place to go. So, and it's much easier in the dry season because there are fewer places where the prey animals can get water. Or if you just want to see these animals, of course, that's where they're likely to be because they need to be near a water source. So they're just some tips for land animals. And like I've said, if you are in a place that's in the country or close to the country, or you have a garden, even if you're in an urban area, you might find that you get animals like foxes or badgers or things like that coming into the place where you live. So keep an eye out for signs of them. And if you've got an area where it's easy to leave footprints, like a gravel drive or even something that's sandy, just take a look at the footprints that are in there and then go and find out what they are if you don't know, because that will tell you what you've got in the area. And if you check them every day, you can see how often they're coming into your garden. So that's land animals. The other thing I wanted to just briefly talk about was looking for animals at sea. And I'm particularly thinking of humpback whales here because that's certainly my experience, the animal that I spent most of my time with at sea. And the thing you're looking for, what you have to remember with humpbacks and all mammals at sea, so that includes dolphins as well and seals and animals like that, they have to come to the surface to breathe because they don't have gills, so they operate with lungs, so they have to come up to breathe. Now, some animals can stay down for quite a long time, having said all of that, but they will have to come up regularly. And how regularly depends on what they're doing. So if you're with a humpback whale, for example, and it's swimming very slowly and it goes down, it could stay down for 20 minutes because it's not really using a lot of energy. And it's a little bit like us. If we're walking, we can walk, if you're reasonably fit, you can probably walk easily for 20 minutes, half an hour, and just keep your normal breathing. But if you then start running, obviously you're going to be using oxygen a lot faster. Your body demands more oxygen, so you're having to breathe much harder. And that's the case with whales as well. So if they're swimming fast, they're likely to come up every 2 to 3 minutes, or maybe even more frequently, depending on what's going on. So typically with a humpback whale engagement, we would they would go down for typically around 3 minutes. As I've said, it could be much longer, and it depends on the whale species. Sperm whales, for example, can go down for a long time. So if you see one at the surface, it might be half an hour before you see it again. So you do need a lot of patience. So that's where they are when they're on the surface. But how do you find them in the first place? Well, when a whale comes up, you'll no doubt be aware of the whale's blow. It's sometimes called a spout. But it's actually a jet of, it's not quite steam, but it's condensing water. So if you think about it, the water vapor that's in the whale's breathing system is all at body temperature. And as it expels that air out through the blowholes, which basically nostrils on the top of its head, that water condenses. So that's what you see when you're looking for a whale. So if you've got a flat sea and not too many waves, not much of a swell, generally you can see that blow, that jet of, it looks like a jet of steam. You can see it from a mile away. So that gives you quite a good chance of finding the whale. However, if the weather conditions are not quite so good, so if you've got a strong wind, for example, or there's a lot of waves or a lot of swell, it can be much harder to spot the blow, particularly if it's windy, because it will tend to blow blow away, not to sound too confusing, so that it doesn't hang in the air anymore. So while it's hanging in the air, you know where that whale was when it came up, so you can get over there, and you know that the chances are, usually what a whale will do when it's swimming, it will take 3 blows at the surface and then go down. And then how long it goes down for depends on what it's doing. So normally you would expect, you've seen one blow, as long as it's the first one, you would expect to see at least 1 or 2 more. However, you might have just seen the last blow because I've said that when you're on the surface of the ocean, it's quite a large area. So you might miss the first blow, or that might be what kind of catches your eye, the corner of your eye, and then you turn to look for additional blows. So that's basically how you find whales when they're within sight. Now, how do you know where to look in the first place? Well, it depends on the animal again. So humpback whales, I'll stick with those because if you are going out whale watching, the chances are you're more likely to be going out to see humpback whales than other types, although there could well be others like orcas. Humpback whales are migratory. And the good news about that is that it means you've got a rough idea where they're coming from and where they're going. So, for example, looking at the whales off the coast of Sydney in Australia, at the beginning of the whale watching season, so that would be around May, June, July, the whales are heading north. So they've been in Antarctica for the duration of the Southern Hemisphere summer. So if you're listening to this and you're from Northern Hemisphere, this is going to be your summers and winters are going to be reversed when you get down to Southern Hemisphere. So December and January in the Southern Hemisphere are the height of summer. So the whales are in Antarctica because the water's warm. And in Antarctica, that's where their major food source is. So they eat krill and plankton and these very small animals. And obviously they eat quite a lot of them. So that's where they generally feed. And then as the temperatures begin to drop, as we start going into autumn in the Southern Hemisphere, that's when they'll go north. And what they do off the east coast of Australia is they'll tend to go up to Queensland, to the warmer waters up there, and they'll be there for the middle of the southern winter. So July, August, September, really, when it's particularly July, August, and that's where they're giving birth and mating. So all the whales go back up there. They're up there for 2-3 months, and then the whole cycle reverses and they go back down to Antarctica so that they're down there for the southern summer. So depending on the time of year that you leave Sydney, so Sydney's on the east coast, so you're going to be looking to your right as you come out to find the whales coming from the south, or you look to your north and you know the chances are they'll be moving away from you if they're up there. Obviously whales do tend to swim around a bit at times. It's not all just A to B, although some whales do quite a lot of that. They won't stop for you on the way up north, but they might be more playful coming back south. But if you know the migratory pattern for the animals, and this is true of any migratory animal, whether it's at sea or on land, and obviously you'll know what time of year you're going, or hopefully you do, you then have an idea of what the animal's doing, where it's likely to be, and the best place to go and find it. So the only other thing to add to that, really, when it comes to finding animals as well as tracking them, is knowing a little bit about their habits. So if you're, for example, wanting to see a predator, if it's a predator that tends to hunt around sunset or sunrise, or even during the night, that tells you when you need to be around. And if you see them during the day, the chances are they're not going to be doing very much. So finding animals is really, I guess to recap, it's understanding a little bit about their behaviours, where you're likely to find them. If you do see tracks, if you're on land that you don't recognise, then just look them up. There's plenty of information online that will give you an idea of what different animal tracks look like. And also if you know when they're likely to have young around, when they're less likely, that will give you an idea of whether it's a small animal or just a young, larger animal that you're looking at the tracks of. And again, knowing their habits, because a lot of animals, even locally, so where I live, there are runs through the top of the garden where certain animals, so hares, for example, I get those in the garden, they're going from one place to another, but they use a regular path. So that's another thing to look for, where there's a run on the ground. This might be identified by flattened grass. So in the same way, if we keep using the same walk in the same place, we'd create a little path in the vegetation. Animals do the same thing. So look for those. And if you're lucky enough, if you've got soft ground that will take an imprint, then if you get the animal's footprint, that will tell you a lot about it. Obviously, dung as well. Different animals' dung looks different because they're eating different things. So again, if you do come across animal dung, take a picture of it and just do a Google. See what if you don't have a remote idea what the animal is, then just sort of pop in where you live, the kind of environment you're in, the country you're in, and that will narrow things down, hopefully enough to make a really good identification. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully that's given you a bit of information about finding animals, whether it's domestically, whether it's at home, or if you're traveling somewhere. The thing I would recommend if you are traveling somewhere, hopefully you'll have a good guide, and if you do, really listen to everything they say. Learn as much as you can. Be a sponge, soak it all up, and it will make the whole experience much more enjoyable because all of a sudden you can read this language of what's going on in the immediate area just by standing there and having a look at the ground, looking to see what's there, look at what's damaged if you're tracking larger animals. And before anybody says a word, you've already got a snapshot of what's going on in that area. So I hope you found that interesting. I'll speak to you on the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.